Once again, we welcome you to Moving Forward with Young Voices. We're very happy to welcome Isaac Willour back to the program. Isaac has been on here before, but for the sake of those who might be meeting you for the first time, Isaac, take a moment. Tell us a little bit about who you are.
Yeah, absolutely, Brian. Thanks for having me back on. Yeah, so I am a corporate analyst at Boyer Research in Pittsburgh. It is a proxy voting and corporate engagement firm, and the long and short of what that means is we engage with large companies to figure out the best way to fight back against the pro-ESG trends in the corporate space. And on top of that, I'm a award-winning journalist. I've been at the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, et cetera, and I'm currently covering a lot of DEI and racial issues along with Campaign 2024.
Yeah, I'm looking at your article here on the Daily Wire, The Fate of the Racially Furious, and I have to admit, I really didn't have a clear timeline of when DEI kind of became part of our lexicon, but the last 4 years, it definitely has become, part of the American experience. Talk to me a little bit about the history of how it came into place among corporate America and what has it accomplished in that time?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting thing because the whole catalyst of this article at the Daily Wire was I saw a news article saying that it had been 4 years since the death of George Floyd. And I guess I was in college. So I wasn't really paying attention to that, but it didn't really feel like 4 years. And then I started thinking about everything that's changed just politically, socially, and I guess in my current job in the corporate space. And you just start realizing how much America became obsessed with diversity, equity, and inclusion in the space of about 4 years, and how much money got poured into this hole and how little it actually accomplished. It's like, so after George Floyd's death, right, you had a ton of corporate focus on this, right? Because the dominant activist narrative told companies, American companies in particular, that they were benefiting from systemic racism, and maybe systemic racism is baked into the cake of your own business, and you need to be actively taking steps to combat this, whether it's in your supply chains or whether it's in your corporate governance, whether it's in your day-to-day practices. You need to make sure that employees of color feel safe and validated and cared for and safe-spaced and completely just cajoled and and coddled and that kind of thing. I'm not perspective neutral on any of this kind of stuff, but so there was a ton of money poured into that. I mean, I mentioned it in the piece. I mean, they pledged. Now there's a difference between what's pledged and what's spent, but pledged is in terms of how valuable this was assessed to be. They pledged $340 billion.
Wow.
Right? That's more than the 2024 budget of the Department of Education, right? To treat this disease of systemic racism that corporate America wasn't sure it had, but was willing to spend a bunch of money to run a bunch of very expensive, and as it turns out, a lot of very stupid tests, figure out whether or not this was worth paying attention to. So that's kind of the history. Obviously, DEI goes back before 2020, but that's the basic summation and the big kind of like the hockey stick graph that we could look at.
It seems like there has been a shift, though, here of late. And I'm just going on, what I've picked up from various news stories, but it seems like at one time, becoming basically a DEI specialist, and I guess universities and colleges hired many of them. I assume corporations did too, but it seems like suddenly that's not as hot a market. Has something shifted there?
Oh, well, yeah, this is a really interesting thing. There's a great piece, the Wall Street Journal. I do not remember who wrote it, or else I would totally give them credit. Called The Rise and Fall of the Chief Diversity Officer, talking about how, it was a flash in the pan market. Like a couple years ago, probably 3 years ago, I was in college at the time. I probably could have pulled this off. I could go in, you can go in, and you could have made $180,000, $190,000, $210,000 a year teaching companies how they're racist, or that's in the least charitable framing of it, of course. But yeah, that used to be a big thing. Every company had one. And then you look now, the market's dried up. People are realizing that the office of Chief Diversity Officer doesn't really add that much to the business. It doesn't really justify hiring an entirely separate person, especially for a six-figure salary. So they do what businesses often do. They either fire the person or they merge the position into something else. But the interesting thing is when they try and merge a DEI kind of office into HR, and we could talk about this more if you want, it turns out it's really difficult to merge DEI into HR because, and I was, a couple years ago, last summer, actually, I was doing an interview with a DEI advocate practitioner person. And I asked her about this, and I'm like, what's the difference between DEI and HR, and she's like, well, DEI isn't really company first. The DEI exists, and one of the reasons, ostensibly, that you get a DEI coordinator is to tell you all the things that are wrong with the company and maybe how to fix them. Less on that. But the problem is that creates a lot of corporate risk. And the whole point of HR is to do risk management and risk mitigation. So it turns out they're two really difficult offices to merge into each other. And I think a lot of corporations are realizing bit by bit that we don't really need the DEI thing, but we really do need the HR thing. So we'll just completely shelve the DEI position. And so a bunch of people who probably had really nice salaries 2 years ago are now out of that position. And I'm going to sit here and pretend I feel bad about that.
No, it reminds me of certain government jobs where essentially, look, you're given a problem to solve, but the catch is if you solve that problem, then you're out of work. So it's actually in your interest if you want to keep that 6-figure salary to make sure that you keep finding problems or there's still a problem to be solved, in perpetuity.
Yeah, no, you're directly incentivized to actually not fix the problem you were brought in to talk about, which basically it's kind of like that Chris Rock sketch. Like, what is it you actually do, right? Like that you end up just running struggle sessions and book groups and all these making people take these stupid unconscious bias tests that do absolutely nothing. Because if there are actual racists inside a business, turns out the actual action steps are fairly straightforward. They may not be easy, but they're fairly simple. And if that's a big problem, then that's something you can write out an action plan for. But it doesn't really seem to be happening all that much, right? So my position in DEI has always been, I've regretted not being able to make this with as much nuance as I'd like sometimes, but I'll say it this way, right? There is, in theory, a good way to use DEI in some way, shape, or form, right? I think Chick-fil-A, for example, does a really good job of this because their Chick-fil-A DEI is not exactly, the Boston University Center for Anti-Racist Research kind of DEI. It's how do we make all of our employees feel valued and belong regardless of cultural background so they can be better workers, because that's the whole point of doing this. I think that's the right way to do DEI, but the reality is most companies are not actively incentivized to have that kind of DEI because, as you said, then it solves problems. And then you just hired someone for $140,000 to fix a problem that got fixed in 1 year.
So talk to me about, for the companies that bring this on board or have over at least the last 4 years, what's the incentive there, or what's the driving force? Because it seems like everybody got on board at once. And I know the term sometimes people use, well, the companies all went woke, but they definitely take DEI and ESG stuff very, very seriously. And I'm just curious what drives that dynamic?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, so part of it is just a bandwagon effect, right? It's if you're looking in May, June, July 2020, and every other company, like if you're a CEO of a Fortune 250, Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 company, and every CEO every fellow CEO you bring on a diversity officer, you have to think about the optics of what does it look like to be the one company that doesn't have the diversity officer. And the reality, unfortunately, in 2020 is that a bunch of people with 3 names who are going to write at the Atlantic, we're going to pop over and call you racist. And that's the incentive to actually create the department itself. But then once you have the department, I mean, a lot of people realized we don't really have to do much with this. They're not incentivized to solve the problem either. Like, if you have a company that's actually racist, which I can't think of any off the top of my head that are, you're not incentivized to fix the problem. And if you have a company that's not racist and has a DEI coordinator, what's the incentive there? There is no actual incentive to create anything. And so I think that's why a lot of this has died out. I mean, the ESG thing is a lot more complicated. We don't really have time to get into that today. But I think a lot of that is the same. But some of them are legitimate issues. DEI less so.
Interesting. And this being Pride Month, I noticed that a lot of corporations, they're flying the rainbow flag, making sure that
but less than you think,
board.
though. You think about a place like Target, right? So I was just at Target's annual meeting, right? Last year, Target got in a bunch of trouble over offering, tuck-friendly swimwear for kids because it's really important that your 2-year-old be able to experience that in all of its glory. You Google Pride kids apparel at Target now, nothing. I tried it. Like, there's not a thing. And they put it in the back of the store, especially in the South, because they were tired of people knocking the displays over. But yeah, no, brands feel the heat, and brands can change. That is my essential premise: is that when brands do dumb things, the assumption we need to have, especially as conservatives trying to take back this kind of corporate space, should not be, well, we need to throw out all the corporations that are woke. Let's boycott every last one of them. It should be, let's figure out a way to engage them helpfully, intellectually, and push them to change. Because I think corporations can change and corporations can do great things and they provide great value. We should incentivize them to do that instead of wasting time on things like DEI.
Again, we're talking with Isaac Willour. He's a corporate analyst at Boyer Research and also a Young Voices contributor. And Isaac, I really appreciate your take on this. You actually give me hope because there's times I feel like, oh man, no matter where I step, I'm going to be in trouble. Where can people follow you? Where can they find you on social media?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter, ISAACWILLOUR, and then youngvoices.org. But yeah, no, take hope, man. The future is bright, and stupid mistakes are not forever.
That's a message I think a lot of us needed to hear. Thank you for being the one to deliver it.
Of course, I'm happy to, Brian. Thanks for having me on.
Okay, look forward to our next conversation.
All right, take care.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. We're happy to welcome Andrea Hitt back to the program. Andrea, great to catch up with you once again. For those meeting you for the first time, take a couple of moments here and just tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on. It's really an honor to be back on your show. So I am the communications manager here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation based in Austin, and I cover communications for our energy and healthcare policy teams.
Well, we've got a doozy of a topic here as it pertains to healthcare. I'm looking at a piece that you had published on thechristianpost.com. Transgender patients deserve compassionate care. Surgery doesn't cut it. Wow. This is something that I have seen in state after state about should this be covered by taxpayer, funded, medical procedures. Where do you even begin on a topic like this to explain, first of all, what's being asked for versus, who's supposed to pay for it?
Exactly. Well, it started off as a couple court cases in West Virginia and North Carolina, where in West Virginia, a Medicaid patient, that's paid for by taxpayers shared between the state and federal government, was asking for the state to cover some gender transition procedures. And in North Carolina, it was the dependent, it's actually a child of some people that were on the state insurance plan, and that insurance plan covers teachers, state employees, retirees, lawmakers, and their dependents. So in one case, it was a child. In one case in West Virginia, it was an adult. And so, the court in North Carolina ruled that, the state must pay for these because they were, quote, medically necessary procedures. And the appeals court in the Fourth Circuit agreed. I think that this case will get up to the Supreme Court, and I personally hope that it gets overturned because in the decision it came down to, is it in the state's interest? Are these surgeries really medically necessary? The court said yes. I and a lot of other medical professionals and politicians happen to disagree with that. And it comes down to why that is. And the truth is that surgery doesn't work. These procedures don't work in, correcting people's gender dysphoria and their concerns with their gender. And, the state and taxpayers shouldn't be forced to fund these controversial procedures that, especially on children, are experimental and in fact cause irreversible harm to the patients. And that's not medicine. That's not medically necessary ever. The point of medicine is to heal the patients, to make them better. And when you're providing these procedures and forcing taxpayers to fund them against their will, against their conscience protections that we often have in place, that's not medicine. That's not scientific. That should not be allowed in this country.
Andrea, I thought you gave a very solid definition in your article about for a procedure to be medically necessary, there are certain standards that need to be met. And I have it in front of me, but if you have it in front of you, I'd love to have you share that definition just so people can understand. This isn't a matter of cold-hearted, dime counters saying, well, it's going to cost money, therefore it shouldn't be done. But there's actually a standard of okay, if it's necessary, then it should probably meet these criteria.
Yes, I do have it. So for a procedure to be medically necessary, it must be needed to diagnose or treat an illness, injury, condition, disease, or its symptoms, and it must meet the accepted standards of medicine. So while there are plenty of studies out there that say that gender affirming care, does create better mental health outcomes and does correct the underlying issues. Lots of reports are starting to come out, including the now well-known CAS report out of the UK that was done on, through the NHS, the National Health Services, as well as other doctors are starting to come out and say there is no good evidence. The previous studies that claim that gender affirming care helps, or so-called gender affirming care, helps. There's no good evidence for that. And these studies were, not conducted to, up to those medical standards. Only one of them, the CAS report found, was truly, up to the highest level. And so if evidence is low or very low on the benefits of these, why are we forcing taxpayers to pay for them? And, why are we allowing people to undergo these procedures that, again, cause irreversible harm and don't actually fix the problems?
Well, and it seems like some of those medical standards are, I'm going to say malleable because I'm trying to be charitable here, but when I know of at least a couple of cases where they said, well, the people who are making those decisions of this is now the standard for medical care, they're actually activists. In other words, it's not being based on science, it's based on what's politically expedient, and that does not seem like a very solid foundation on which to base medical standards.
That would be correct. I think it's very interesting that, we talk about now the party that claims follow the science does not actually follow the actual science. And, unfortunately, people are suffering as a result of these activist studies, these activist doctors. And when we talk about the emerging medical opinion, we've seen this with the COVID-19 pandemic as well, where doctors coming out and public health professionals coming out and saying, this is the science, this is what we have to say on this, particularly on masking. And then, you wait a few years and more evidence comes out that in fact wasn't true. And we're seeing that happen. And unfortunately, in both of those cases, the results of that are immense harm to patients, to the public, and people deserve better than that.
Well, and there's also this perverse incentive, and I'm not saying that all medicine is driven by money, but when a person or a child is entered into the so-called gender affirming care, that is a long-term commitment. They're going to be back for more and more treatments, more and more surgeries, more and more evaluations. And again, if this is being paid for by the taxpayers, well, that's a pretty steady source of income for the medical organizations that are providing those.
You're right. There's absolutely a financial incentive. And I find it, especially when it comes to children. I was a teenage girl once, and we're seeing this. I know Abigail Schreier has touched on this a lot. We're seeing this particularly in young girls, where it's hard to be a teenage girl. And I cannot imagine how hard it is growing up now in the world where social media is the way that it is. And given all of that, the fact that these procedures prey off of people's deep insecurities and deep, questions about who they are, going through, puberty and growing up and being a teenager, you have a lot of frustrations with your body. These doctors and the hospitals that are funding these procedures are preying off of people's deeply held insecurities. They are profiting off of it, and they are putting these children through, life-altering, body-altering procedures that cause infertility. Once you undergo these surgeries, you have parts of you removed that you simply cannot get back. You face infertility and sterility. And a lot of people are coming out now saying that they underwent these procedures as, 15, 16-year-olds. They can't consent to that. When you are 16 years old, you can barely get a driver's license. You can't get a tattoo. You cannot go to the store and buy alcohol. And yet we're allowing these children to undergo permanent life-altering procedures that they end up regretting and cause them lifelong harm. And I would ask, are these patients truly being adequately informed about the risks? And it calls into a lot of question when you have, people like the Daily Wire's Matt Walsh's producer, went undercover and got a recommendation to undergo sex change surgeries from a 22-minute video call. And that calls into a huge question, the validity of, are these diagnoses even real, and what are we putting children and adults through? And, fundamentally it comes down to, what is truth, and is transgenderism true? And I believe that there are two genders. That's controversial now, two sexes. And so, to say that you can become one or become the other, this simply isn't true. And people deserve care that actually provides them with what they need, the therapy or other resources that they need to correct, why are you actually undergoing this dysphoria? Because unfortunately, a lot of people, it's because they're not comfortable with their sexuality or they've undergone severe sexual trauma, and people deserve care that helps them come to terms with that instead of permanently altering their bodies and forcing taxpayers to pay for it.
I love that there is a definite tone of compassion in the way that you approach this subject. And others are saying, oh, that's just like Ayn Rand. You're on your own. But no, I think you're approaching this from a very rational but compassionate way. Andrea, how can people follow you on social media? Where can they find your writing and your work?
Thank you. You can follow me on X, formerly Twitter, at @A_Hitt_. And I'm also on Instagram and Facebook.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to welcome Nathalie Voit back to the program. She is a Young Voices contributor. And Nathalie, for those who are meeting you for the first time, take a moment. Tell us about who you are.
Yeah, so my name is Nathalie. I'm a writer, and recently my pieces have been featured in Newsweek, so I'm very happy about that. And I'm also looking to become an English teacher here in Switzerland. But I contribute to several outlets in my spare time, and I also regularly write for one outlet called C3 Solutions, so you can find me online.
Well, I'm looking at a piece that was published in the DC Journal about improving safety in New York City requires new civil commitment policies. And, when I think about New York City, I kind of think there's some kind of scary things associated with New York, particularly the subways. We've all seen videos of mentally ill or homeless people acting out on the subways, and you think, oh boy, that must be terrifying to be on a subway car with them. But what are some of the things that New York has done in the wake of some of these very high-profile cases that have come to light? Have they taken steps to try to improve public safety in that regard?
Yeah, so actually, after years of inaction and a lot of mayors promising to fix homelessness, in November 2022, so this was 2 years ago, New York City launched the Care Community and Action Program, a mental health plan for New York, and it empowered officials to commit individuals for so basically it expanded the threshold for involuntary commitment. And in a way, like the law always allowed it, like it was possible, so it's not illegal, but it dispelled the myth that you need to have that you need to meet certain criteria, very strict criteria in order to be involuntarily committed. So they launched that program, and part of that program was also launching Scout. So it was specifically in response to the string of subway crimes that started with the death of Michelle Go, a 40-year-old financial consultant who was pushed by a homeless man in the subway in New York City.
Now, this is one of those areas where I feel like there has to be a balance struck. On the one hand, I want people who may pose a danger to the public, to be evaluated, and if they're a threat, to be taken off the street. But at the same time, I don't want it to be too easy, because it seems like that could be abused as well, in terms of involuntarily committing people.
Right. So exactly, it's a fine line. I think that's why I propose in my piece to establish an oversight committee that has that can independently ensure that there are no civil violations, and also the other thing I propose is also to have uniform legislation across the United States, so that civil rights, I'm forgetting the name.
Liberties,
or civil
maybe?
liberties. Sorry, yeah, our civil liberties aren't infringed upon. Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar at all with a psychiatrist by the name of Dr. Thomas Saz? Have you ever heard of his writings?
I do not think I have. No.
Okay, it's spelled differently, SZA, SZZ. I mean, it's a very different spelling, but he was one who really made the case that, the most dangerous thing that could happen is the combining of mental health and government. And the reason was, he says, when we had lunatic asylums, basically they kind of became a convenient place to take inconvenient people, dissidents and the like, and get them out of sight of the public. And I don't necessarily think he was entirely wrong to sound a note of caution there, but it seems like the scale has tipped way in the other direction now, to where, for a person to get committed or to be taken in for evaluation, they have to do something, shockingly horrific in order to merit that kind of intervention. Is there a sweet spot or a middle ground where, the public safety can be addressed without running roughshod over, that individual's rights?
Right. Yeah. So even though the law allows and governments can decide, like the myth that it requires like this very strict criteria is actually not true. And that's why it's still a legal thing, what New York City did. But basically mayors for decades after the institutionalization, of the 1960s, after that, people went the other way, the other extreme. And now, like you said, it requires an overt act, or basically somebody, pushing somebody off the subway, because actually the guy who pushed Michelle Go, he had actually been, he was under some kind of program where people were supposed to be monitoring him, but it failed because it wasn't being, there wasn't enough funding, and people the government didn't take it seriously enough. But I think there is a sweet spot, and I think you also kind of have to experiment to an extent, as long as there's some kind of oversight committee. I think that's the key. But doing nothing like we've been doing for the last decades isn't the answer. So I think at least it's a step in the right direction, and I'm sure there will be maybe some problems. It's bound to happen, but I think with the oversight committee, that's really the key to ensuring and having full transparency. Yeah. It
seems like one of the things that complicates New York's situation too is people really are strongly disincentivized to protect themselves. If for instance, someone is being attacked. Are you familiar with the case of Daniel Penny, who intervened when there was a mentally ill, homeless individual who had been attacking people on the subway, actually for months, and had multiple, had a very long criminal record. And Daniel Penny, as a U.S. Marine, had been trained in, how to restrain somebody. And he restrained the guy in a chokehold, and he ended up dying. And then he was charged with manslaughter. And it was like, wow, there's no incentive to step up if you see someone being threatened or being attacked, even if it seems like intervening would be the right thing to do. There's some very real risk that goes along with that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, because it's just inaction on the part of the government. There's a really good report from the New York Times on how there's been year after year of just inaction through city agencies, all levels of government, the entire every single level of government. And in this case, there's no incentives. But now with this new approach, I think it basically enables city officials to commit people if there's still criteria. It's not that they can just take people. So they have to not be able to take care of themselves. And let me find, I think I mentioned the other criteria. Yeah, so they have to be exhibiting signs of untreated mental illness, which a lot of people would say, if you've been to the New York Metro, it seems like they are exhibiting signs, or they're unable to fulfill their basic human needs, so there's still criteria, but obviously the threshold is much lower now.
So I have to ask you this, is the threat exaggerated? I mean, what we see on the news sometimes tends to grow in our imaginations to where, oh my goodness. Yeah. So you tell me, hey, Bryan, you are going to be in New York next week and you're going to be riding on the subway. I guarantee you I would have a little flutter in my heart going, oh boy. I'd be nervous about that, but is that necessarily justified, or does it get blown out of proportion?
It's definitely blown out of proportion as with anything in the media. So actually, even in the height of the crisis of these subway crimes, there was about one violent crime per 1 million rides. And since then, it's been falling down since mid-2022. So it's definitely exaggerated. So of course, it's always better to make a public system safer if you can. But yeah, there's no need to freak out about going to the subway.
I'm glad to hear that. Not that I'm going to be on the subway next week, but just no. I want to know that trying to keep these things in perspective isn't always easy, and sadly, when issues like mental health can be kind of a touchy issue, somewhat politicized, and I'm not even sure why that is.
Yeah, definitely. So. Yeah, actually 2 in 3 homeless people, there was a new study that they found out actually suffer from a mental illness. So it's definitely a tricky issue, but I have hope that with this new initiative, at least we can make some change, meaningful change.
Well, and hopefully if it bears good fruit, other large metropolitan areas can look at it and adopt what works,
exactly.
And use it to their advantage as well. Well, I appreciate your very well-informed take on, again, what's a fairly touchy subject, but it sounds like there are some solutions at hand. Where can people best follow you to get more of your work, or to follow you on social media?
Yeah, well, actually through Young Voices, my platform is there. So if somebody looks up my name and Young Voices, they just find all of the articles that I've written via them. And also just on my LinkedIn page, I would say.
Okay. I sure appreciate
Nathalie Voit. Yeah.
Do you want to spell that real quick?
Yeah, I should spell it out because it's with an H. So it's the European way. It's Nathalie V as in Victor, little v, OIT.